Welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host, and as those who have been listening to my show know that I've been following the Israel-Palestine issue. Actually, how do I want to put it? The massacre of Gazans, of Palestinians by Israel for the last 3 weeks. Currently, I've had three, I don't know exactly, I can't recall, but I think for the last 3 or 4 weeks I've been talking about this issue, and I'm going to continue to talk about this issue. Why? Because our media, our mainstream media, doesn't talk about it correctly, doesn't talk about it properly, doesn't offer both perspectives, doesn't offer the Palestinian point of view. And I'm delighted to have my guest today because he's a Palestinian. We rarely hear Palestinians' perspective in the mainstream media. In fact, we never get it. We never get it. In fact, I think there was only one other radio station, Don Bastanti's station, that KPFK, that would talk about the Palestinian perspective. You know, and I don't know how many of you know, but I do commentaries for the Progressive Voices channel on TuneIn. And today I did a commentary on police brutality. I don't know how many are you familiar with. In fact, all of us are probably familiar with the shooting that took place in Ferguson, Missouri by the police against a young black unarmed teen. And when I listen to the mainstream media, except my show, I don't consider myself mainstream media. I'm like sort of independent. This is an independent radio station. It's not corporately owned. But when I listen to the mainstream media in Los Angeles, it's always white guys analyzing black folks. And that's what I talked about in my commentary today on the Progressive Voices channel. So it's the same thing with the Israel-Palestine issue. We always have Jewish folks analyzing Palestinians. When are you going to hear from Palestinians to get their point of view about what's taking place? So that today is, I'm delighted to have my guest, Dr. Azzam Tamimi. He's a Palestinian academic and political activist. Since July 2006, Dr. Tamimi has been the chairman and editor-in-chief Al Hawar TV channel. So he's in the media too. That's one of the things I'm going to ask him about, the media from the Arab world. How is it different from the Western world? And he's host of 2 weekly programs, Marajat, which is a biographical series of prominent thinkers and politicians in the Arab world, and Waqafat, a series that explores the history of political and philosophical thought and practice in the Muslim world. Dr. Tamimi is the author of several books on Middle Eastern and Islamic politics, including Hamas, A History from Within. I'm also going to ask him about Hamas because when I was driving into the station today, I heard on KFI, they always characterize Hamas as terrorist, right? Oh, the terrorist organization Hamas. Well, what I know, they also characterize Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. Do you remember? He was characterized by the United States State Department as a terrorist, Nelson Mandela. So this is, we have to think about these issues more critically. And so I hope my guest, Dr. Azzam Tamimi, will help me and help KCAA listeners to the Kathleen Wells Show think about the Israel-Palestine issue more critically. So, Dr. Tamimi, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Kathleen.
So what is the first question I want to ask you? I want to ask you, you're in the media in the Arab world. Do you see the media in the Western world, in the West? And give us your perspective about the mainstream media in the West in terms of their coverage, their reportage of the Israel-Palestine issue.
Well, it's not really possible to generalize because I live in the UK usually, although I am now in Jordan on vacation. But I usually live in London, and the media is not the same. And if you talk about the media in one country in the West, it's not the same as talking about the same media in another country. Yet I know from my own following as well as from what I read and hear, that in the United States of America, the mainstream media, as you rightly characterized, does not really give much space for the other side of the story, especially when it comes to Israel. To a large extent, this is true also in Europe, although in Europe, there are outlets in the mainstream media that dare disagree with the common notion, and they do, from time to time, give the other side an opportunity to express their opinions.
So you agree that in other words, you've stated that the mainstream media in the West basically generally, because you have a few exceptions, presents one point of view, and that point of view of Israel. We do not hear from Palestinians their point of view that often. That is essentially what you've summarized, correct?
Indeed, and of course there are clear reasons for this. Some of these reasons are to do with history and culture, but some are to do with the economics, because many of these Western mainstream media, especially newspapers and TV channels, radio stations also, who rely on advertising, they come under enormous pressure from their clients if they ever toe a different line to what their clients want to hear or watch or read.
Mm-hmm. So it's all about the economics, it's about an agenda, and it's about propaganda. So I'm delighted to have you on my show so that we can get a different perspective. So today, driving into the station, I heard that the truce between Israel... For 3 weeks now, Israel has been conducting a massacre of Gazans, of Palestinians in Gaza. And there was a truce that took place, or talks were taking place in Cairo, but I just heard recently that the truce fell apart. Talk to me about the truce and why it fell apart.
Yes, this was a temporary truce to give an opportunity to negotiators who met in Cairo to reach some sort of a deal. From the Gaza point of view, they want any long-term truce agreement to be to depend on lifting the siege. Probably you already know that Gaza has been under tight siege for the past 8 years. Gaza is a very narrow strip of land overlooking the Mediterranean. From the other two sides, it's surrounded by what is today Israel and what used to be one day Palestine, and also by Egypt. And unfortunately, since Hamas was elected in a democratic election by the Palestinian people, the United States of America and Israel put it on the terrorism list and imposed an international siege on it. And as a result of this siege, people are suffering. So they're now asking for lifting the siege. The Israelis are, on the other hand, insisting that the lifting of the siege should be reciprocated with demilitarizing Gaza, which means taking away the weapons that Hamas and the other Palestinian factions have. And the Palestinians are saying, why demilitarize us? Why don't you demilitarize Israel as well? Why can't you deal fairly with both sides? And the reason the temporary ceasefire fell apart yesterday is that the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't want to agree on a truce with the Palestinians, but wanted to come out with some sort of a prize. And the prize he thought he was getting out with was the assassination of Hamas top military commander Mohammed al-Deif. And rather than kill Mohammed al-Deif, who is now safe and sound, the Israeli Air Force killed his wife and his infant boy Ali, as well as an entire family with which they were staying. And Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to assassinate Mohammed al-Deif and then go back to his own constituency and tell them that we've managed to eliminate an arch terrorist, and therefore now we don't have to enter with any deal that does not meet our own conditions. And now we are back to square number one. And today, 3 or 4 hours ago, there was a statement by the spokesperson for Izzuddin al-Qassam, which is the military wing of Hamas movement, who gave the Israelis an ultimatum. He first told the Palestinian negotiating team to pull out of Cairo because the Israelis were not serious. They were not interested in reaching a ceasefire agreement. And secondly, he threatened World Airlines not to fly into Ben Gurion Airport as of 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, because if the Israelis are going to continue to be free to kill the Palestinians and impose a blockade on them, the Palestinians will have to respond with firing rockets that will also harm the Israelis economically, and that will include navigation. And this was a language that was unprecedentedly quite strong by the military wing of Hamas. And it is understandable that it derives its strength from feeling betrayed by the Israelis, who were only talking until yesterday noon, and then this escalation came suddenly.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's step back a little bit. 99% of the media in the Western world, characterizes the crisis, the fight, the war, the tension, the conflict between Israel and Palestine as terrorists, the Palestinians, Hamas. What is the word I want to use? Intimidating or I'm losing the word I want to use, but somehow frightening the Israeli people. How would you characterize that dynamic between Israel and Palestine?
Well, it's really a long story. It depends on where you want to start telling it. But very briefly, you see, we the Palestinians were living in this land for thousands of years. And we didn't really bother who ruled us so long as we were in our land, in our homes. And then suddenly, as a result of the First World War and as a result of the rise in anti-Semitism in Europe, the Europeans decided, especially after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, of which Palestine was part, decided to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine where all these Jews who were persecuted in Europe could go and live far away from trouble in Europe and establish their own homeland. Now, the problem here is that Palestine was not a vacant land. There were already people living there. Take, for instance, the story of my own mother. My own mother, who was born in 1932, she was born in Beersheba. And by the time she reached the age 16, that was when the Israeli armed gangs who were held by the British at the time and then by the Russians and by some other Europeans came into their villages and into their towns and forced them out of them. And my mother had to flee to Hebron. And like my mother, millions of Palestinians, well, actually, it was not millions in 1948 when this happened. It was about 900,000. But now with their descendants, the number, of course, has grown to millions. So the real story, as far as we are concerned, is that we were living in peace and tranquility. We were part of the Ottoman Empire, and before the Ottoman Empire, we were part of whatever kingdom or dynasty or sultanate or empire that existed, until the Europeans held the Zionists to come and take our homes in order to create a homeland for the Jews who were persecuted in Europe. It's as if we, the Palestinians, who were the Nazis and who were the fascists who persecuted the Jews, we had actually nothing to do with it. I fully sympathize with what happened to the Jews in Europe, but why should I and my mother and my father and millions of my Palestinian fellow citizens should pay for the crimes of somebody else? You cannot simply solve somebody's problem at the expense of somebody else. So now when we are asking for our homes back, when we are asking for our lands back, peacefully, and they don't give them to us, and when we resort to arms to fight those who have driven us out of our homes by the force of arms, we are then called terrorists. And I usually, when I speak to students in Europe, unfortunately I haven't been able to come to America since 9/11, but when I travel in Europe and speak to university students, and I tell them, just go to the library next door. Go to the library and read a book about the history of the region, and you will find out who is the terrorist. The terrorists are the ones who came from Europe, armed by the people who send them in order to drive us out of our own homes.
Well, many people believe the narrative that you hear often in the mainstream media is that Palestine was a land with no people. They believe that. And they also believe that, many believe that there's a biblical reference to Jews' entitlement to the land. What is your response to those two issues?
Kathleen, may God bless the soul of Grace Halsell. I don't know if you know the name, but she was a great journalist and author. She wrote for New York Times and she wrote a number of books. She started with a book about racism against African Americans, and then she made a voyage, a pilgrimage to Palestine, where she was initially under the impression that actually Palestine was an empty land and that the Israelites came back to the land of their ancestors, until she saw the Palestinians with her own eyes, and she visited them in their houses, and she dined with them, and she listened to their stories. And then she went to the refugee camps and saw the Palestinians stacked on top of each other. Where did all these refugees who are in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and even in the West Bank and in Gaza, where did they come from? Probably very few people realize or know that out of 1.8 million Palestinians who live in Gaza today, more than 1.5 million are refugees. Their homes and towns are today in what is called Israel. They came from there. No, the land wasn't vacant. The land wasn't empty. And that's why the Zionists who came to the land embarked on a series of massacres. Let people go and read in the library or even Google the term Deir Yassin, the massacre of Deir Yassin, how the Deir Yassin villagers were killed, were massacred in cold blood in order to use their story to intimidate and terrify the rest of the population and drive them out of the land. And that's how many Palestinians became refugees afterwards. I met once, when I was a visiting professor in Japan, I met a very famous Japanese photographer who fell in love with a Jewish lady as a young man and became a staunch supporter of Israel and went to live in a kibbutz with her. And one day, leaving the kibbutz and trying to tour around, he discovered some relics, and he asked about the relics. This is a story he told me himself, and because of this story, he became a world-famous photographer. He was told that those relics date to the Roman times. He wasn't convinced because they didn't look so old. He started asking around and about and discovered that these relics were the remains of the Palestinians who were driven out of their homes only 10 or 20 years earlier in 1948. So he bought a camera and started going around and taking pictures and asking questions about the names, the original names of these villages. And then he went to refugee camps in the neighborhoods and tried to identify people who were living in the refugee camps whose fathers and mothers were the original inhabitants in the areas where the relics were found. These are facts that are facts on the ground. These are facts that are documented in books, in documentaries, in films. It's just that people are lazy to read, are lazy to find out for themselves.
That's right. I agree with you. Who controls the narrative holds the power. We're going to take a break. In fact, I'd like to how do you feel about taking phone calls, Dr. Tamimi?
I don't mind at all. I'd love that.
You'd love that. Okay, so if there are any listeners out there, KCA listeners to the Kathleen Wells Show, who would like to speak with Dr. Azzam Tamimi, who's a Palestinian, he is now in Jordan. We're talking about Palestine and Israel. We're talking about Palestine. I think it's important to talk about Palestine, and I think it's important to listen to Palestinians. Feel free to call in. The number is toll-free, 1-888-909-1050. We'll take a break, and we'll be back with Dr. Tamimi. Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show, and my guest is Dr. Azzam Tamimi. He's a Palestinian academic and political activist. He is also the author of several books on Middle Eastern and Islamic politics, including Hamas, A History from Within. He's also the author of Power Sharing, Islam and Secularism in the Middle East. So, Dr. Tamimi, I want to ask you, I know that one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And as I mentioned before, Nelson Mandela was once on the U.S. State Department terrorist list. And we all know Nelson Mandela, right? So Hamas, in the West, we always characterize Hamas as a terrorist organization. Talk to me about Hamas.
Well, Hamas came into existence in 1987. Prior to that, it used to be the precursor of Hamas, the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, used to be a socio-political organization working for the reform of society and for providing the needy with help in various forms, medical aid, educational aid, social welfare, etc. But the reason the Muslim Brotherhood transformed themselves inside Palestine into the Islamic resistance movement Hamas is that in December 1987, something happened that triggered the first Palestinian uprising, what we refer to as the Intifada, when an Israeli driver drove what the Palestinians believed to be a deliberate act and crushed a minibus carrying Palestinian laborers, killing several of them, and that sparked an uprising because Palestinians were feeling for a long time the brunt of occupation, discrimination against them, the large number of Palestinian prisoners detained by Israelis, and all the problems of settlement and the confiscation of their land, etc. So the uprising was an opportunity to express their anger and their impatience with the continuation of occupation. And Hamas was born out of that moment. What distinguishes Hamas from the other Palestinian quasi-secular movements is that Hamas' frame of reference is the Islamic culture. And this is something that requires some detailed explanation. I know we don't have time for it. I tried to explain it in detail in my book, Islam and Secularism. Because you see, what happened in our region, in our part of the world, including Palestine, is that as a result of Western colonialism, which started in the late 19th century and continued until nearly until the middle of the 20th century in many parts, is that our Muslim culture came under attack from a wave of westernization that wanted to mold our own societies the way the colonial authorities deemed fit for them to control. So Islamic movements like the Muslim Brotherhood came into existence in 1928 as a reaction to this, to preserve Islamic culture and to revive the Muslim spirit. Because we are Muslims, we believe that we have our own culture, we are proud of it. Why should we borrow and copycat some other people's cultures, which we think are not necessarily making them the happiest people on the face of the earth? So this is what distinguishes Hamas. Apart from that, Hamas is nothing but a national liberation movement. Its objective is to rid the Palestinian people of occupation, to restore their legitimate rights to them, and to tell the world the story that I and you now are trying to tell the listeners of this radio station, that many people are preventing us from telling them, that we are the victims, we are the ones who have been oppressed, and we have the right to struggle for our freedom.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you, do you believe that we are operating within sort of, how do some people put it, like a clash of civilizations? Is this something that we should concern ourselves about?
Not really, no. You see, the notion of the clash of civilization exists among extremists on both sides of the divide. when we say West and we say East, these are divisions that we create sometimes in order to try and explain ourselves or to justify ourselves. But we are human beings, whether you are American or you are European or you are Arab, whether you are Muslim or you are Christian or you are Jewish or you are atheist or Buddhist or whatever. We are essentially human beings, and we share a lot in common as human beings. The people who talk about a conflict of civilizations, they want to justify either the onslaught of imperialism that seeks to dispossess poorer nations and take away their resources from them and control them, or on the other hand, justify a reaction to this, as we are seeing today happen in our parts of the world. This ISIS or the Islamic State phenomenon, which is so murderous and so ugly, is actually, in essence, a reaction to the attempts to intervene in the region. And we haven't forgotten the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, and the attempts to try and change people's cultures and lives. As a result, you get such deranged individuals react in the manner that we have seen. So I don't believe in the theory of a conflict of cultures. I believe that there is a common human denominator that we can all share. We still have our differences. That's only natural. Even the Quran, our book, which we believe to be the Word of God, just like Christians believe the Bible or the Jews believe the Torah to be the Word of God, tells us that it is only natural that we disagree on things because we are different. But that doesn't mean we eliminate the things that bring us together and make us a one human community.
Mm-hmm. So another issue that I'd like to discuss is that many in the West don't realize that Israel is occupying Palestine, that they're an occupier. And in fact, I read that an occupier, this is something I've read about international law, an occupier doesn't have a right to self-defense. What are your thoughts about that?
Indeed. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people's brains are washed continuously, 24 hours a day. There is a brainwashing process happening through the media, through the social networks, although I must say that the social networks are today providing us with a much bigger space than the mainstream media provides for genuine discussion about differences of opinions and different discourses and different narratives. But yes, and this is all controlled by politics and by the hegemony of global businesses. They decide that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They decide that the Palestinians are the aggressors. They decide that Israel is acting in self-defense. And all of this in contravention of the facts of history. Mm-hmm. And that's why when students start actually reading, when they start finding out, and when people who come from the West and visit Palestine and do not agree to restrict themselves to the Jewish area and go and find for themselves in the Arab populated areas about the history of this region, they immediately discover that they've been living in an illusion. They've been brainwashed because the facts are completely different. And that's why I referred to Grace Halsell, because she mentioned this very clearly in some of her books after her conversion when she visited Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Her name is Grace Halsell? How do you spell her last name? How do you...
Grace, of course, J-R-A-C-E.
Uh-huh.
And then Halsell, H-A-L-S, I think E-double-L, if I'm not mistaken. Halsell.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with her. I know of Dorothy Parker back in the 30s or 40s changing her perspective. Why don't we take a call now from Elizabeth in Virginia? Hi, Elizabeth. Do you have a question?
Hi, yes. Thank you for your interesting guest. I wanted to return the discussion to Hamas. One of the things that you frequently see when they speak of Hamas is that they took control of Gaza as if it were an intentional act and overthrew Fatah. but they ignore what preceded that fighting between the two. Could your guest discuss that?
Dr. Tamimi, did you hear the question?
Yes, that's a brilliant question. Thank you very much. Indeed. You see, the story begins, as I said earlier, Kathleen, it's a long story and it depends where you begin. But for this particular topic, it started in January 2006. That's when the Palestinians had the first ever free democratic election. And guess what the result was? Hamas overwhelmingly won the majority of the seats in parliament. Immediately, Ehud Olmert, who was the prime minister of Israel at the time, and now who is going to prison for corruption, told his American friends that we cannot accept this result, and we have to tell Hamas that unless it accepted 3 conditions, we will not recognize its democratic win. And these became known afterwards as the Quartet Conditions. Probably some of your listeners have heard the term. Quartet refers to the United Nations, United States, Russia, and the European Union. And actually the conditions were coined by Olmert himself, but marketed to the Americans. And then the Americans, unfortunately, with their blind, I mean the Americans here, I mean the American administration, I don't mean the American people. I have great respect for the American people, and I know that many American citizens do understand the truth and they support justice for the Palestinians. But the American administration at the time adopted the 3 conditions. The first condition is that Hamas should recognize Israel's right to exist. The second condition is that Hamas should disarm and renounce violence. And the third condition is that Hamas should accept all the agreements already signed between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. Of course, as far as Hamas is concerned, these conditions were conditions of surrender, of capitulation. And Israel, who took our land and who is occupying our land and who dispossessed us, is not asked to do anything, is not expected to do anything. Now, as a result of Hamas' rejection of these conditions, they immediately imposed restrictions on it. And they even told Mahmoud Abbas and his Palestinian Authority not to deal with Hamas, and if they dealt with Hamas, they would be sanctioned as well. And the Americans started funding certain factions within the Palestinian Authority in order to derail the government that was formed by Hamas, because it was the victor and the winner in those elections. Now, to cut the story short, in February 2007, the Saudis brokered an agreement between the 2 main Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, and brought them to agree to form a national unity government. And that national unity government started working, and the prime minister was Ismail Haniyeh. But the Americans were very unhappy with it. They sent General Dayton to Gaza, who started arming a Palestinian faction led by someone called Mohammed Dahlan. And they were the ones who were plotting a coup against the national unity government agreed in Mecca as a result of the brokerage of the Saudis. So who actually carried out the coup? It wasn't Hamas. Hamas was in a self-defense position. They wanted to unseat it, they wanted to crush it, and Hamas defended itself, and as a result, it took over Gaza, whereas Fatah, with the help of Israel, took over the West Bank. So this is the story. I hope it's clear. I'm not sure whether I was clear enough.
So, Elizabeth, are you still on the line?
Yes, I think he added a great deal, and it was terribly important that people understand that that battle was not initiated by Hamas, that it was in fact initiated by the funding, training, and support by the U.S. and Israel of groups in opposition to Hamas. Could he also explain? Could I ask another question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. I think it's terribly important also to explain the position that Hamas has with respect to recognizing Israel's right to exist. As I understand it, it is because Israel will not permit the Palestinians to exist as a state, and that Hamas has made a number of proposals which have been not only rejected, but which Israel has refused to negotiate with them. Is that too long a question?
Well, thank you very much.
The issue is
yes.
Hamas's statement that it refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist, and why.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Did you get that, Dr. Tamimi?
Yes, I have, and I think this is another important question. You see, you will not find anywhere in the world a political entity or a state or a government that happens to be in conflict with another entity or another movement or another government that insists, before talking about solving the problem, that we should be recognized for our legitimate right to exist. I mean, they exist. They exist in my father's land. They exist in my mother's house. What is there to recognize? What they want us to recognize, actually, is the way in which they came to exist. And I usually compare this to South Africa. And we go back to Nelson Mandela, a great man who once said, we will never be free until the Palestinians are free. And probably that's why he was partly designated as a terrorist. And he's a great hero of mine. In South Africa, they had a real problem because there was a minority of whites who originally came from Europe, who took the land of the indigenous population and enslaved them, oppressed them, and even incarcerated them in big prisons called townships, and used them as cheap labor while discriminating against them, treating them as if they were not human. Now, when Nelson Mandela, after a long struggle, he and his comrades were offered an opportunity to talk about resolving this, they came up with a principal condition that apartheid must come to an end, because apartheid was the problem. Apartheid as an ideology made white superior to black, made black inferior to white, and you cannot live in any human society that does this. Now, similarly in Palestine, we have something called Zionism. Zionism is like apartheid. Zionism is an ideology that believes that Jews are superior to everybody else. And I know that there are many Jews who are not Zionists, they are even opposed to Zionists, and I have many friends who are Jewish, either Orthodox or even secular, who disagree with Zionism. But Zionism is a very sinister idea, because it says that if you happen to be Jewish, and wherever you live in the world, you have the right to come to Palestine and become immediately a citizen of the country and have full rights, while the Palestinians who were born in the country and whose ancestors for thousands of years were born in the country have no rights whatsoever. So what we are saying to the Israelis, don't talk to us about recognizing any legitimacy or existence. Talk to us about this discriminatory, racist ideology that you came to us with from Europe. It was an ideology that was a reaction to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was evil, but the reaction to it in the form of Zionism was equally evil, because Zionism said that Jews have the right to come to Palestine, take it away from its people, and live there instead and create their heaven on earth. So what I would say is that rather than talk about recognizing legitimacy or existence, let's discuss Zionism. Once the Israelis come to us, Palestinians, or come to Hamas and tell it, we are willing to renounce Zionism, we are willing then to say to them, let's talk how we can live together in the future happily forever.
And, I think it's a phony question anyway that they impose because countries come and go. Countries don't have a right to exist. People have a right to exist, not
Exactly.
countries. Ukraine, you see what's happening in Ukraine. You see what happened with South Sudan, North Sudan. Countries come and go. People have a right to exist, not countries. So we're going to take a break. If you'd like to call in with questions for Dr. Tamimi, the number is toll free 1-888-909-1050. We're talking about how Palestinians as people have the right to exist. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show. And today my guest is Dr. Azzam Tamimi, who is a Palestinian academic and political activist. Since July 2006, Dr. Tamimi has been the chairman and editor-in-chief of Al Hawar TV channel and host of 2 weekly programs, Murajarat, which is a biographical series of prominent thinkers and politicians in the Arab world, and Waqafat, a series that explores the history of political and philosophical thought and practice in the Muslim world. So, Dr. Tamimi, we were talking about apartheid, and I don't know if you know, but I used to have a show on Sundays that aired on this radio station called Palestine Today. We aired 28 episodes, and what I learned from one of the Palestinians, which I did not know, was that in Hebron, in the West Bank, Palestinians have to walk down a separate street, have to walk on a different side of the street than Israelis. I didn't know that.
Yes, Hebron is my hometown, by the way, and I cannot go to Hebron, but my sister lives there. My extended family, most of them are still there, and it's like hell for the Palestinians, because they, apart from the big settlements that surround Hebron, like Kriyat Arba and others, the very center of the town was occupied by a small group of settlers who took over Palestinian homes and made them into their own yeshivas and quarters. And to protect them, there are hundreds of Israeli troops dedicated for their protection. And the sort of discrimination, the sort of attacks that happen, and you hear this even from Westerners, especially journalists who visit Hebron, and who come back with this impression that this reminds them of South Africa. It just reminds them of a regime that discriminates against others because of the skin of their color, or because of their religion, or because of their ethnicity, or their culture.
And, I, as a black woman, can relate to this sort of topsy-turvy way of presenting information. That's called what? Propaganda. Do you know that we get a lot of propaganda here in the West in our media about what's actually taking place in Israel and in Palestine, and what Palestinians actually desire and want for their lives? We get a lot of propaganda here.
Indeed, there is a lot of propaganda, but I would say that in this time of ours, there is little excuse for people who want to find the truth if they don't make an effort to learn the truth. The truth is readily available, much easier than before. It's more accessible than before through the social networks, through the books in the libraries, through alternative media, through people talking to people, meeting with them, inviting speakers, etc. The effort that you are making in your own radio station fits within this endeavor also. And I think it's possible. And I'm glad to see that an increasing number of people are realizing the truth. So the propaganda machine is no longer as successful as it used to be.
And one of the things that, as an American, I can say that many Americans, despite social media, yes, there is an awakening, but yet there are too many that are ignorant. Ignorance is not bliss. There are too many that don't know. They're particularly Christian and Jewish Zionists. They rely on biblical interpretations to maintain the occupation of Palestine, to maintain negating Palestinians of their civil and human rights. They rely on. So there are too many Americans who are influenced by this propaganda, and they need to get more adequately informed. I'll say that as an American. Too many Americans are not adequately informed, and our politicians do follow blindly the mandate, the requirements of Zionism. I think that's the situation. That's how I see it.
Kathleen, you refer to people who rely on the Bible to come up with such ideas that justify taking other people's properties or discriminating against them or oppressing them. If people were to really think for a moment, anybody, whether Muslim or Christian or Jewish or a follower of any religion, who claims that God tells him he is better than other human beings because of the color of his skin or because of an affiliation to a certain religion, that goes against God himself. I don't believe that God wants one community to take another community's land because they happen to be believers in a certain creed. That is totally unacceptable. That is the essence of racism. Sometimes people justify racism by blaming it on God. It is as if God told us to do it. God told us to kill. God told us to take other people's lands. But God told us to persecute people. We are blaming it on God, whereas we are the criminals. We are the ones who are doing it for our own ends.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a beautiful note to end on. In fact, yes, I've heard many Christian Zionists and many Jewish Zionists believe that God chose Jewish people. They're chosen, and so they can screw over other people. I don't believe that. It's delightful to have you on the show. I'll have you on again, Dr. Tamimi. I'm pleased that you were a guest. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Next week.
Bye.